The unplayed song. The rain had just stopped falling over Lowe's Angels when Keanu Reeves walked into the dim rehearsal room, its concrete walls echoing faint notes from a worn-out Fender amp. His silhouette cast a long shadow on the floor, his leather boots leaving light imprints on the scuffed wood. His hands, calloused from years of both stunt work and strumming strings, trembled just slightly, not because of the weight of his guitar, but because of the truth he had carried for years. A truth he had never spoken. Not even to her. Sandra Bullock's laugh could still make him forget where he was, even decades after their first on-screen connection. It was back in the 90s, those early press junkets, long night shoots, and the quiet pauses between fame and normalcy. There had always been something beneath their chemistry, something unscripted, but life kept getting in the way. Timing was the villain in their love story, always arriving early or too late. Marriage rumors came and went. Relationships rose and crumbled. And through it all, their friendship stood like a lighthouse in an ever-churning sea. But now Keanu had decided. He wasn't going to run anymore. He was going to tell her the truth about how the Foo Fighters of all things had become the melody of his hidden emotions. The idea had sparked months ago. It was late one night when Keanu sat alone in his home studio. His band had long since disbanded, but the strings still called to him, and in that quiet solitude he came across an old Foo Fighters live performance. Dave Grohl's voice, raw and unfiltered, bled into Keanu's chest like a confession. "There goes my hero," the song rang, and Keanu had laughed softly, sadly, because the only hero he could think of was Sandra. Not for the fame nor the awards, but for how she had saved him without ever knowing it. When he lost Jennifer, when he buried his daughter, Sandra was the only person who sent him handwritten letters. Not emails, not texts, but letters. In her slanted handwriting, she would write things like, "I know you don't want to talk, so I won't ask questions, but I'll sit in silence with you from wherever I am." And that was all he needed. 3 weeks before the Foo Fighters concert, Keanu received a call from his assistant, Amara, as he was coming out of a motorcycle shop in Malibu. "Keanu, you've got an invite to the Foo Fighters' private reunion show. Small venue, just a few hundred people, it's for charity." His heart skipped. "Where?" "San Diego, the rooftop of the Thompson Hotel. VIP only. You want me to RSVP?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes, and invite Sandra." There was a pause on the line. "She's in Atlanta filming." "I know, but tell her I think it's time we heard the song." Amara didn't understand. She didn't need to. Sandra received the invitation the next day. When she opened the handwritten note attached, her eyes widened. "You once said you'd sit in silence with me. Now I want to sing with you. Rooftop, Foo Fighters, let the chords say what I never could. K." For a long moment, she didn't move. Her assistant, Janine, watched her closely. "Is something wrong?" Sandra shook her head, her lips trembling. "No, something might finally be right." The night before the concert, Keanu couldn't sleep. He stayed up in a modest beach house, the sound of waves crashing as if echoing the unrest inside him. The room smelled of old wood, vinyl records, and eucalyptus candles Sandra had once gifted him. He remembered her words when she handed it to him on his birthday years ago. "Inhale peace, exhale the past." That night he replayed every moment they'd shared, every pause that could have been a kiss, every hug that lingered a second too long. She had seen him at his lowest and still called him her lighthouse. And yet he'd hidden behind fear, telling himself that some stories weren't meant to be love stories. But this time, the melody wouldn't let him stay silent. The rooftop concert was set against a glowing California sunset. The crowd was small, intimate. No cameras, just music lovers, friends, and a few stars who knew how to keep secrets. The skyline shimmered in orange and gold, and the air smelled of ocean salt and fresh leather jackets. Keanu arrived early. He wore his signature black suit, no tie, his long hair slightly windswept. He looked like a man about to walk into either a war or a wedding. He stood backstage for a moment, holding a guitar in his hand. That's when Dave Grohl walked over and smirked. "You ready?" Keanu nodded. "Thanks for this." Dave clapped his shoulder. "You said you had something to say. Let the strings do the talking, man." And then she arrived. Sandra walked in wearing a dark green jacket over a simple white tee and jeans. No makeup, hair loose, effortlessly her. When their eyes met, the noise of the crowd disappeared. Keanu stepped forward, his hands sweating. "You came." She smiled. You sent a letter, I couldn't ignore that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he gently reached into his pocket and pulled out a single music sheet. She glanced at it. Handwritten chords. I wrote something, he whispered, but I can't sing it, not unless you're there. Her voice caught. You want me to go on stage with you? He shook his head. No, I want you to sit in the front row, just like you said you would, in silence, and listen. Sandra blinked, her heart racing. She nodded slowly. The stage lights dimmed. Dave Grohl introduced Keanu Reeves. The crowd cheered, some shocked, some intrigued, but Keanu didn't smile. He walked up slowly, sat on a wooden stool under a single spotlight, and held his guitar like a lifeline. He cleared his throat. This isn't a Foo Fighters song. This is something personal for someone I should have sung to years ago. And then he began to play. The melody was haunting, slow, minor chords with just enough soul to crack a heart open. The lyrics weren't perfect. They weren't polished, but they were real. You saw me in shadows and never asked for the light. You waited in silence when words would have been easier. You taught me that love isn't always loud, but I hear it every time you stay. In the front row, Sandra's eyes welled up. She wasn't just listening to a song. She was watching the man she had always loved finally let his armor fall. As the final chord echoed into the twilight, Keanu stood up, walked to the edge of the stage, and locked eyes with her. The rooftop was silent. The band didn't start the next set. The audience didn't clap. They just watched. And then, in the quiet night air, Keanu said the words that he had carried longer than he could remember. Sandra, I think I've been in love with you since we missed that first kiss on the bus. Her silence was never empty. The rooftop stayed quiet long after the final note faded into the San Diego sky. Keanu's declaration hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire, fragile and still flickering. It was the kind of silence that demanded reverence, the kind that only followed truths too powerful to be clapped at. The audience didn't cheer. They simply watched Sandra Bullock, the woman who had once been America's sweetheart, and Keanu Reeves, the man who had quietly become the soul of cinema, locked in a moment that defied scripts, headlines, or expectation. Sandra didn't move, not immediately. She sat frozen in her seat, hands resting on her lap, eyes glistening with something older than surprise. She had heard confessions before, had been serenaded on sets, pursued at galas, even proposed to at awkward press tour, but nothing had ever pierced her like this, because this wasn't a performance. It wasn't publicity. It wasn't some romantic stunt before a premiere. This was Keanu, and Keanu had always been real. She rose slowly, not to flee, but to process. She needed air, not because she was overwhelmed, but because, for the first time in years, something inside her had started breathing again. Keanu stepped down from the stage as Dave Grohl nodded and gently picked up his guitar to begin the next set. The audience's attention shifted back to the music, giving Keanu and Sandra the sacred thing they needed most right now, privacy in the middle of a crowd. They met in a quiet corner of the rooftop, away from the light, beneath a cluster of string bulbs that swayed softly with the wind. Keanu looked at her, his heart racing not from fear but from release. He had said it, finally, and now the silence between them wasn't emptiness, it was suspense. You didn't have to say it like that, she finally whispered, her voice so low it almost dissolved into the breeze. He smiled gently. There wasn't another way, not anymore. Sandra looked down, her hands trembling slightly. Do you know how many times I almost told you, over coffee, on flights, in trailers during those long movie nights? But every time I pulled back, because I told myself, what if I ruin the one good thing that's always been consistent in my life? Keanu's expression softened. I told myself the same thing, but then I realized silence can be just as much of a betrayal as a lie. She exhaled slowly, eyes searching his for traces of doubt, but all she saw was vulnerability and history, years of near misses and what-ifs, and underneath it all, an affection that had never been buried, just carefully preserved. Her voice broke as she said, I don't know how to go from being your friend to something else. He didn't rush, he never did. Instead, he stepped closer and said, we won't go anywhere, we'll just be. Let it become whatever it becomes. But I needed you to know that every version of peace I've ever known had you in it. Sandra blinked back tears. You think this is peace? Keanu chuckled softly. No, not yet, but this is the start. They sat side by side on the rooftop ledge for nearly an hour, listening to the Foo Fighters in the distance, not talking much, just letting the quiet unravel years of unspoken tension. Keanu handed her his old leather jacket when the breeze got colder. It smelled like cedar wood and engine oil, and something that reminded her of a summer they once spent shooting in Seattle. She didn't speak it out loud, but she remembered exactly when she had first fallen for him. Not as a co-star, not as a friend, but as a man. It was during a break from filming in 1996 after a late-night shoot where everything went wrong. Cameras failed. Schedules shifted. Everyone was frustrated, but Keanu had pulled out a thermos, poured her warm tea, and simply said, "Let's wait this one out together." That was the night she realized something rare. Keanu didn't fix problems. He stayed with them, sat with them, like a lighthouse steady in the storm. And somehow, by being present, he made even the worst moments survivable. Now, decades later, he was still doing the same thing, sitting beside her, not offering promises or future predictions, but simply showing up. The next morning, Sandra woke up in her hotel suite with the ocean visible beyond the glass. Her phone was buzzing, articles, texts, social media. The world had noticed. Even in a small venue with no official press, a few clips had leaked. Fans had recorded fragments of the song, blurry videos capturing Keanu's trembling voice, the vulnerable lyrics, and Sandra's unmoving face. Kendra was trending again. Some were calling it a publicity stunt. Others were writing op-eds about mature love. But none of it mattered, because only two people knew the truth of that night, and both were still figuring out what it meant. She got up, wrapped herself in a hotel robe, and walked to the balcony. The waves were loud this morning, insistent, as if echoing her own thoughts. Her mind was a flood of memories, Keanu holding her hand when her mother passed, him texting her in the middle of the night during her divorce with just 3 words, "Still here, always." All those times she needed someone and he showed up, not as a savior, but as a witness. Love, she realized, wasn't about rescue. It was about recognition. And she had recognized him long ago. Later that afternoon, Keanu invited her to join him on a short motorcycle ride. He brought a second helmet. No pressure, just 2 friends chasing wind. She laughed and said, "I'll only come if you promise not to drive like you're in John Wick." He smiled, lifting an eyebrow. "I'll drive like it's the lake house, slow, meaningful, with just enough mystery." They rode along the coast, the California sun warming their backs, the cliffs stretching along the Pacific like a painting unraveling in real time. They didn't speak much. Keanu drove, Sandra leaned in, and for the first time in years, both of them felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. At one point, they pulled over to a cliffside lookout, a quiet spot where the sea crashed below and wildflowers dotted the edge of the bluff. Sandra turned to him and said, "What if we mess this up?" Keanu shrugged. "Then we start over, or we go back to being whatever we were before, but I'd rather risk the mess than keep pretending I don't see you the way I do." She looked at him, really looked, and her reply wasn't a speech. It wasn't a declaration. She simply stepped forward and leaned her forehead against his. No kiss, no drama, just contact. "Then let's begin," she whispered. And in that moment, the waves didn't matter. The crowd didn't matter. The years between their almost love and the current one didn't matter. What mattered was that for the first time, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock weren't acting. They weren't hiding. They weren't dodging timing or tabloid noise. They were just them. 2 imperfect souls who had always circled one another like satellites. And now, finally, they were moving closer, pulled by gravity, pulled by truth. The weight of timing. The ride along the Pacific Highway had been more than just a nostalgic joyride. It was an exhale of years of silence, misunderstandings, missed chances, and deliberate restraint. But now, the morning after, Sandra Bullock sat alone in her Beachview suite, the gauzy curtains shifting in the salty breeze while a half-drunk cup of chamomile cooled beside her. Her phone buzzed repeatedly, yet she ignored every alert, choosing instead to live in the rarest kind of moment, a still one. For someone like her, who lived under public scrutiny for over 3 decades, silence had always been a luxury. Now it was sacred. She opened the drawer of the nightstand and pulled out a folded letter she'd kept for years. The paper was weathered, creased with corners softened by time. It was from Keanu, dated nearly a decade ago, scribbled on a torn napkin from a Vancouver coffee shop. She had found it left under her trailer door on the last day of filming a movie they never promoted. It said, "You deserve someone who sees you off screen. And I hope I learn to be that person before the final credits. She had read it dozens of times, each occasion digging a little deeper into her chest. Now after last night she understood something vital Keanu had been trying to tell her all along. His love had always been quiet, not performative. It was tucked into the way he let her shine during interviews, the way he remembered her brother's birthday even after he passed, the way he called her Sandy only when she cried, never when she laughed. He loved her not with declarations, but with devotion. Downstairs, Keanu stood barefoot on the hotel patio, a guitar resting gently on his lap. He strummed softly, not for a song, but to center his nerves. Last night had been monumental, but now that the truth had been spoken, the terrifying question loomed. What now? There were no scripts to follow, no directors to guide their next scene. Love in real life didn't come with a soundtrack or an editor. And Keanu, for all his iconic stoicism, felt a vulnerability he hadn't touched since his 20s. He wasn't scared that Sandra didn't love him. He was scared that love, after years of being paused, would feel foreign. The elevator chimed behind him, and as if summoned by fate, Sandra stepped onto the patio, her bare feet brushing against the stone tiles, a soft cashmere sweater wrapped around her. She didn't speak right away. Neither did he. Instead, she walked to the railing, leaned on it, and stared out at the crashing waves. "I read your old letter again," she said finally, her voice laced with something between sorrow and awe. "The one from Vancouver." Keanu looked up slowly. Did it feel different now? She nodded, eyes locked on the horizon. "It felt like you were never waiting for the right time. You were just waiting for me to hear it." He set the guitar aside, rose, and joined her at the railing. "I didn't know how to say it. I thought if I stayed close enough, maybe you'd feel it." She turned to him, the morning sun framing her face in gold. "I always did, but I didn't trust the timing. I was scared of what we'd lose if we tried to have more." Keanu reached up and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Timing is a thief," he said. "It steals moments while you hesitate." She nodded slowly. "But maybe we needed to become who we are now to understand what this really means." Later that day, they took a walk through a quiet neighborhood near La Jolla. No cameras, no fans, just two people rediscovering each other. They talked about everything and nothing. The absurdity of red carpets, the peaceful rebellion of reading paperbacks, the favorite lines from forgotten indie films. Keanu told her about the first time he saw her laugh on set and how he pretended to drop a prop just so he could hear it again. Sandra confessed she used to keep old voice messages from him, playing them on nights she felt lost. As they passed a little bookstore, she paused. "Do you remember this place?" she asked. Keanu smiled. "Of course. The first time you cried in front of me was right there on that bench." Sandra laughed softly. "Because you bought me a copy of The Prophet and underlined the words, and ever has it been that love knows not its own depth until the hour of separation. You said it was your way of apologizing for showing up late." "I wasn't apologizing for being late," Keanu replied, his eyes searching hers. "I was apologizing for not telling you why. I just buried someone I loved." The air went still. Sandra's smile faded into something deeper, heavier. "I didn't know that until years later." He took her hand gently. "I didn't want to burden you, but I should have trusted you could carry more than I assumed." They sat on the bench again, the years folding over themselves like pages. For the first time, the space between them wasn't filled with what-ifs or pauses. It was filled with presence. That evening back at the hotel, they watched the sky bleed into orange and violet, the waves catching the last light like glass. Keanu turned to her and asked, "If this were a movie, what would happen now?" Sandra smiled. "The audience would want a kiss." He nodded, "And the actors?" She leaned forward slowly, deliberately. "The actors would want something real." And then there it was, not a dramatic Hollywood kiss, but something gentler, more reverent. The kind of kiss that doesn't ignite fire but anchors it. A kiss that didn't shout, "We're in love," but whispered, "We always were." But even in moments of peace, life moves forward. And the next morning brought the first test. A call from her agent. An offer for a 6-month shoot in Europe. High profile, huge budget, career-defining. Keanu saw the look in her eyes before she even spoke. "You have to take it," he said. "I don't want to leave." "I know, but you've waited your whole life to tell your own stories. Don't put them on hold for me." She hesitated. "What about us?" He stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. "We're not a moment anymore, Sandy. We're a melody, and real music doesn't end when the room goes quiet. It echoes." As she boarded the private flight 3 days later, they didn't say goodbye. Just, "I'll find you in the pauses. And I'll wait in the echoes." Their love wasn't sudden. It wasn't cinematic in the usual sense, but it was resilient. It was born from shared silence, carried by patience, and carved into the spaces where their lives had once run parallel. In the silence between oceans, the cobbled streets of Florence echoed softly beneath Sandra's boots as she stepped into the cool hush of the early morning. Her scarf fluttered in the breeze, a quiet red accent against the muted palette of her wool coat. It had been 26 days since she'd landed in Europe for the film's shoot. 26 days since she'd kissed Keanu goodbye beneath a sleepy California sky, whispering that their melody would echo even in absence. And yet, no matter how many takes she delivered under the heavy lights, no matter how many elaborate sets she walked through, she carried the weight of distance in her chest like a stone hidden inside silk. The director loved her performance. The crew adored her warmth. The press was already whispering about awards and comeback narratives, but Sandra Bullock, the woman, not the actress, not the headline, was distracted. At night, she'd open her notebook, the one Keanu had once gifted her, with a quote on the first page, "Write until the silence makes sense." And she would write, not scripts, not notes, but pieces of him, letters she didn't always send. Sentences that captured the ache, the gratitude, the fear, the longing. Because in all her life, she had never been loved the way Keanu Reeves loved her, not loudly, not possessively, but with a gentleness that asked for nothing and gave everything. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Keanu was living quietly in Los Angeles, trying to fill his days with things that didn't feel like waiting. He returned to his garage, working on an old bike rebuild. He practiced the song he had written for her, not to perform again, but to remember. He read the books she had once mentioned offhand, watched her old interviews late at night, tracing her expressions with his eyes as if trying to understand her from afar. But most importantly, he wrote. Every night before going to bed, he wrote her a letter. Some he emailed, some he mailed. Some he just tucked into the back of his journal, unsure if they were meant to be shared or simply exhaled. The letters were never dramatic. They didn't ask her to return early or beg for reassurance. Instead, they shared the mundane details of his days, what he cooked, the sunset he watched, the song that played while he drove. He wanted her to feel like she wasn't missing anything. That he was living a life she was still part of, even in her absence. One letter read, "Today I saw an elderly couple in the park holding hands feeding birds. The man wiped her mouth gently with a napkin. I thought of us. Not now, but maybe years from now. Maybe we'll be the quiet ones in the park while the world rushes around us." Sandra read that one 3 times, then she wept. Weeks passed. Spring began to fold itself into the corners of Italy, and with it came the pressure. Her publicist called, offering her 2 more scripts, one an Oscar vehicle, the other a long-awaited sequel that fans were begging for. Her agent warned her that after Florence, she had to strike while the iron was hot. Hollywood wasn't built on patience. And yet all Sandra wanted was to be on a bench beside a man who saw her beyond the spotlight. One night, she found herself wandering the narrow streets after wrapping late. Her feet led her to the Piazza della Signoria, where she sat beside the statue of Perseus, staring up at the stars barely visible through the city's warm haze. She dialed him without thinking. It was early morning in LA, and he picked up on the second ring. "Hey," he said, his voice groggy but calm. "I couldn't sleep," she whispered. "It's cold here. Want me to tell you a story? Only if it ends with something beautiful." Keanu paused, then said, "Okay. Once upon a time, there were 2 people who loved each other across an ocean. They sent pieces of themselves in letters, in thoughts, in songs. They didn't need to touch to stay connected, because their love wasn't in the presence, it was in the knowing. The knowing that they were seen, heard, and felt, no matter the distance." Sandra closed her eyes, tears sliding down her cheeks. "That's not a story," she whispered. "That's a mirror." But reality wasn't always poetic. The weeks that followed brought stress. Keanu was approached by a major studio with a contract for a lead role in a franchise reboot. Filming would begin just weeks after Sandra's return, and it would take him to Japan for 5 months. When he told her over a call, she went silent. "That's great, Key," she said, but her voice trembled. "I won't sign it unless—" "No," she cut him off. "Don't say that. We both know you have to do what's right for you." He sighed. "What's right for me is us." Sandra looked out the window of her hotel suite. The Florence sky was painted in soft peach and indigo. "I just got you. I don't want the world to take you again." "It won't," Keanu said gently. "We'll hold each other in the gaps." Their next few weeks were an exercise in emotional endurance. They sent voice notes instead of texts, video called despite their exhaustion, and made each other part of every mundane ritual. She'd prop her phone on the kitchen counter while boiling pasta and talk to him about nothing. He'd show her the stars from his rooftop, recounting memories they hadn't shared but would. Still, doubt crept in. Not about the love, but about whether love could survive in the machinery of their lives. Sandra questioned whether it was fair to ask for so much while giving so little. Keanu wondered if his quiet nature could truly withstand the turbulence of her world. Both knew that love required more than feeling. It demanded choice over and over again. Then came the storm. A gossip outlet published a story titled, "Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, Love or Illusion." It dissected their past, speculated about their present, and twisted facts into fiction. Photos from years apart were stitched together to imply a timeline that didn't exist. The media wasn't interested in truth, they wanted spectacle. Sandra's team advised her to distance publicly. No statements, let it fade, don't feed the flames. Keanu, ever the ghost in celebrity culture, said nothing. But Sandra, she refused silence. She wrote an open letter, not to the press, not to her fans, but to him. And she posted it, a photo of a sunrise over Florence, captioned, "Dear Keanu, I've spent my life walking tightropes between what people expect and what I know to be real. You are real, and I'm done pretending that love must be private to be pure. Let them write headlines, let them speculate. You are the quiet I prayed for in the chaos. And if loving you means walking into the storm, then I'll meet you there, drenched but unafraid." Yes, the post went viral in minutes. Keanu saw it while standing in his kitchen barefoot holding a cup of tea. His hands trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of being seen fully, publicly, irrevocably. He called her that night. When she answered, he simply said, "I've been yours since the day you laughed on that bus." She replied, "And I've been yours since the moment you offered me tea instead of advice." They didn't know what the future held, but they knew this. Love doesn't need clarity to be true. It doesn't need convenience to endure. It only needs courage. And two people who choose it again and again and again. The reunion was not the end. It was the beginning of summer in Los Angeles when Sandra's plane touched down. Not the award season buzz of January, not the gray nostalgia of November. This was a different kind of return. The air smelled like blooming jacaranda trees and sun-warmed asphalt. The sky, vast and untarnished, seemed to welcome her like an old friend who never demanded explanations. She had been away for over 2 months, and now everything, her schedule, her steps, her pulse, moved toward one person. Keanu. He hadn't met her at the airport, not because he didn't want to, but because they had agreed on something unspoken. They didn't want cameras catching the first touch, the first look, the possible tears. What they were rebuilding didn't belong to tabloids. It belonged to quiet, to intention, to the sacredness of privacy reclaimed. So Sandra rode in a modest black car, no entourage, no assistant, just her and her thoughts. She held a small envelope in her lap. Inside it was a single photograph, one taken decades ago during the rap party of Speed. They were both laughing, arms flung around each other, unaware of the camera. She had kept it all these years, buried between the pages of an unused journal. On the back, she had written 3 words just before boarding the plane. "I'm ready now." She didn't need flowers or a red carpet. She didn't need music or fanfare. She needed a door, a quiet knock, and the man who had once waited through years of almosts without turning bitter. When she arrived at Keanu's home, tucked between the hills, private and modest, her heart raced, not with nerves but with memory, with longing, with everything that had been paused, held back, or left unsaid over years of late-night calls, gentle avoidance, and tender distance. She knocked once. The door opened slowly, and there he was, barefoot, wearing a black t-shirt that hung slightly loose over jeans, his hair pulled back, his eyes steady but soft. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he stepped aside and whispered, "Welcome home." Inside, everything felt unchanged. The bookshelves still overstuffed with poetry, philosophy, and vinyl records. The scent of sandalwood incense faintly hung in the air. The familiar creak of the old wooden floors. Even the dog, an old mutt named Arlo, perked up with a groggy bark and nestled against her leg like she'd never left. Keanu led her to the kitchen where 2 mugs of tea waited. She smiled. Still know how to brew a good welcome. He looked at her and said, I've been practicing every day since you left. They sat, and for a long time neither spoke, because in that silence there was no distance left. Finally, she reached into her coat pocket and slid the photograph toward him. He turned it over, read the words, and looked up at her. You're ready? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. She nodded, for you, for us, for whatever comes next. Keanu didn't lean in to kiss her. He didn't grab her hands or rush toward the drama of reconciliation. He simply reached across the table and placed his fingers gently over hers. Then let's build something honest. The weeks that followed were like learning how to breathe all over again. It wasn't perfect. They argued softly but honestly, about small things at first, her tendency to overcommit, his instinct to withdraw. Then about bigger things, how much of their story to share with the world, how to balance their individual careers without losing this fragile, blooming us. Keanu confessed how hard it had been to watch her in Florence, so visible, so celebrated, while he stayed in the shadows. Not because he envied her, but because he feared that the light she was finally claiming might blind her to what they had. Sandra admitted her fear of dependency. I've always needed to be strong, she said one night, sitting on the patio wrapped in a blanket. I've built an empire on standing alone, and now being seen by you makes me feel soft, exposed. Keanu smiled gently. But isn't that the point of love, to let someone hold the parts of you you've hidden from the world? They learned each other's rhythms again. He cooked her breakfast without asking how she liked her eggs, because he remembered. She reorganized his bookshelf alphabetically, not to control, but to offer a sense of calm he never asked for but clearly needed. They went grocery shopping together, held hands at obscure film screenings, took long walks in quiet neighborhoods where no one expected them to be anything but human. But still, the world wasn't entirely absent. Paparazzi photos began to surface, headlines resurfaced, interviewers began to prod. One morning, Keanu received a call from his agent. Netflix wants you both for a dual interview, the voice said. 1 hour special, tell your love story, public wants it. He declined before the sentence finished. When Sandra asked why, he looked her in the eyes and said, we gave them the movies, let's keep the real story for ourselves. But not all storms came from outside. One afternoon, while clearing a storage room in Keanu's house, Sandra found a box. Inside were old letters, photos, mementos of a life before her, before now. One letter, clearly from a woman who had once meant something to him, ended with the words, you were never mine, Keanu, not fully, because your heart was already walking beside someone else. I just never knew who. Sandra read it once, then again. A quiet ache spread through her chest. Later that evening, as they sat watching the sunset, she asked gently, was I always there, even when I was? Keanu didn't pretend. He didn't rush to comfort or correct. He nodded slowly and said, yes, I just didn't know what to do with it, so I loved you from a distance. And every time someone else came close, I measured them against the silence I had with you. No one ever matched it. She leaned her head on his shoulder, a soft exhale leaving her lips. I wish I had known. You weren't supposed to, he said. Not until you were ready. The next week, Sandra received word from her team. She had been nominated for a major Lifetime Achievement Award. The gala was black tie, cameras everywhere. She hadn't attended one in years, not since her mother's passing. Not since the days where smiling under the lights had felt like war. She hesitated. But Keanu, standing behind her in the kitchen that morning, wrapped his arms around her waist and said, go, and wear red. She turned, eyebrows raised. Why red? Because that's the color you wore the first time I realized I couldn't look away. And so she did. The night of the gala, she arrived in a crimson gown, timeless and powerful. The crowd erupted. Photographers flashed, celebrities whispered. But what no one saw, what no camera caught, was Keanu standing just beyond the red carpet, dressed in a simple black suit, hidden in the shadows, smiling as she passed. She gave her speech later that night, eloquent and gracious. But when she reached the end, she paused, heart pounding. Then, with millions watching, she said, tonight I thank everyone who stood with me. But there's one person who stood in silence for years, never asking for attention, never demanding more, just being there. You once told me that timing is a thief, and now I finally believe you, because tonight I'm taking my time back and giving it to you." She didn't say his name, she didn't have to. Somewhere backstage, Keanu closed his eyes. And for the first time in decades, a man who had seen too much loss, too much delay, too much emptiness felt full. The life between the lines. The house they moved into wasn't grand or polished. It sat tucked beneath sycamore trees on a quiet street in Laurel Canyon, shielded by wild hedges and hummingbirds that visited like old friends. There was no gate, no security team, just a wooden fence, a wind chime near the back door, and two names on a handwritten mailbox label, K. Reeves and S. Bullock. They had moved in together quietly, without announcement or contract, not to begin a new chapter, but to continue one that had always existed off-screen, in margins and shadows, unfinished but alive. It began with boxes full of their separate pasts, photos, scripts, mugs, letters, receipts from trips they never took together. They unpacked slowly, laughing at each other's strange habits, marveling at the coincidences. They had bought the same poetry collection years apart. Both owned the exact same vinyl of Leonard Cohen's You Want It Darker. They had bookmarked the same passage in The Prophet without ever knowing. These were not signs, they decided. They were reminders. That even when their lives had diverged wildly in the public eye, their hearts had been walking quietly in the same direction. But real life, they both knew, was not made of montages. It was made of mornings. There were burned pancakes, misunderstood silences, days where she questioned if she was still enough. Nights where he disappeared emotionally, lost in memories of grief that still visited without warning. They didn't always get it right. Sometimes they argued about nothing, just so they could clear the fog of everything. But they learned over time that love wasn't the absence of friction, it was the agreement to stay through it. To return to the conversation even when tired. To sit in the discomfort until truth returned. Keanu would often find her in the garden, kneeling in soil, dirt under her nails, face tilted toward the sun. She had taken to growing tomatoes, basil, and jasmine. "These plants," she told him once, "they don't bloom when you demand it, you just have to keep showing up." He knew then that she was speaking of more than gardens. The Foo Fighters tour was scheduled to return to Los Angeles in the fall. They hadn't talked about it, not directly. It felt like a closed loop, something holy that didn't need revisiting. But one evening, as they sat listening to old records in the den, Sandra turned to him and said, "They're coming back." Keanu looked up, surprised. "I know. Do you want to go?" He hesitated. "Only if we go as us." Sandra smiled slowly, then booked 2 tickets. And just like that, the beginning circled back, not to repeat itself, but to complete something. The concert venue was different this time, larger, louder, packed with thousands of people. But they moved through it like ghosts, invisible in a crowd that didn't realize that 2 of the most beloved faces in cinema were standing in row 16, hand in hand, not behind velvet ropes, not on a screen, but as 2 people who had walked through decades of what-ifs and finally decided to answer them. Dave Grohl's voice echoed through the space, powerful and ragged. When Everlong began, Keanu gently leaned toward her and whispered, "This song always reminds me of the time you laughed in the pouring rain and said, 'I could do this forever if you're the one standing beside me.'" She blinked. "That was 20 years ago. And I haven't forgotten a second since." A few months later, something changed. Sandra had been feeling tired, nothing dramatic, just off. She chalked it up to the stress of the previous year. But after fainting once while planting in the yard, she finally let Keanu drive her to a private clinic. Tests were run, days passed. And then the doctor, a soft-spoken woman with eyes that seemed reluctant to speak, gave them the news. Sandra had an autoimmune condition. Not terminal, not immediately threatening, but progressive. It would mean adjustments. Monitoring, days of fatigue, possible complications. Nothing life-ending, but definitely life-changing. She sat quietly in the passenger seat on the drive home, staring out the window as if watching her body from a distance. Keanu said nothing, just held her hand, his thumb moving in small circles across her skin. When they reached the house, she went straight to the garden, sat in the dirt, hands trembling. He sat beside her, not to comfort, but to companion. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, "but I'm not going anywhere." She turned to him. "What if I forget how to be fun? What if I lose pieces of myself?" He met her gaze. "Then I'll remember them for you. I'll hold your laughter when it hides. I'll be your mirror when you can't recognize the reflection." And in that moment, Sandra Bullock, who had been strong for the entire world, let herself fall apart in front of the only man who didn't need her to be anything other than human. They adjusted. She stepped back from heavy film commitments, started a foundation for autoimmune awareness, wrote more, spoke less. Keanu began working with young musicians, scoring independent films, teaching in quiet corners of LA. They lived a smaller life, but not a lesser one. And then, one autumn afternoon, they did something neither had ever done. They eloped. No guests, no gowns, no headlines. Just a lake house in Oregon, a justice of the peace, and 2 vows scribbled on napkins from a roadside diner. He said, "You taught me that love doesn't arrive with a bang. It grows like roots under earth, steady and unseen. I spent half my life waiting for the right moment, and I'm spending the rest making this the right one." She replied, "You were always the pause between my noise, the space where I could be small without feeling weak. I don't want a perfect love story. I want ours, messy, earned, true." Years later, no one remembered the headlines. The world moved on. New stars emerged, new stories told. But in a quiet house behind sycamores, Keanu Reeves still brewed her tea every morning. Sandra Bullock still sang off-key while watering the jasmine. And every evening they sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, sometimes speaking, often not, because silence between them was no longer empty. It was sacred. It was love, slow, late, and infinitely worth the wait.